Before kings raised their thrones and empires ruled the earth, there was an age when heaven bent to forbidden desire. Angels descended from the heights, leaving behind their glory, drawn by the beauty of the daughters of men. From the secret pact was born a generation of colossi, the Nephilim, giants who walked like gods among mortals. They did not merely dominate with strength. They corrupted with the knowledge of hidden arts, unleashing war, sorcery, and rivers of blood upon the earth. Their hunger was insatiable, their power untamed, and neither kings nor warriors could resist them. The divine order had been shattered, and creation itself trembled in ruin. Amid screams and battles, through cities reduced to ashes and kingdoms set ablaze, lingers the memory of a conflict where the divine and the human united in rebellion. And the price of that transgression echoed in catastrophe, the eternal sentence of the fallen angels, and the inevitable downfall of their colossal sons. Before the first kingdoms carved their banners into stone, before the roar of empires filled the earth, the Eternal stretched forth his voice across the cosmos. From the heights of glory, his command thundered, not as words carried by wind, but as a decree that pulsed through creation itself. It summoned not mortals nor beasts, but the radiant watchers, angels forged in flame, veiled in light, and charged with a task that would reshape the fate of mankind. Their calling was not conquest, nor judgment, but vigilance. To observe the children of dust, to guard them from what lay beyond the veil, and to keep the balance of a fragile world that teetered between innocence and corruption. The watchers emerged like living stars, descending through the vast canopy of night. To men, they seemed like pillars of fire piercing the sky, settling upon the mountain peaks and river crossings of the earth. Their eyes blazed like suns, their voices rolled like distant thunder, yet they cloaked themselves in restraint, for the Almighty had forbidden them dominion. They walked unseen through valleys and fields, their wings folded in humility, their glory veiled from the simple hearts of mortals. And yet even in silence, their presence pressed upon the world like an unseen weight, a reminder that the heavens watched with vigilance. Among the watchers burned a fascination unknown even to themselves. For never before had they walked the soil of men, nor touched the rivers that ran like veins through creation. They beheld the laughter of children, the struggles of laborers, the smoke rising from altars built of crude stone. They saw weakness wrapped in innocence, and innocence wrapped in beauty. And with every heartbeat they observed, a strange longing stirred within their immortal essence, something that resembled love, but carried within it the seed of temptation. The Eternal had given them a decree: observe, protect, but do not interfere. Yet as the days of man multiplied, as songs of harvest and cries of birth echoed across the land, the watchers lingered too long in their watching. Their gaze shifted from the heavens toward the earth, from duty toward desire. The veil that once separated their flame from flesh grew thin, trembling under the weight of curiosity. It was not rebellion, not yet, but the first shadow creeping into their hearts, and shadows once kindled are not easily quenched. Heaven itself felt the tension, for the Eternal sees the end before the beginning. His mercy had placed guardians over mankind, but his omniscience knew what fire stirs when the immortal gazes upon the mortal. The other angels sang their eternal hymns before his throne, yet the watchers stood upon the edges of earth, caught between two worlds. They were loyal, radiant, and yet restless, their wings still carrying the scent of heaven while their eyes traced the beauty of earth. This was no accident. It was the testing ground of freedom, the proving of obedience, and the spark of a coming storm. As time passed, the earth remained ignorant of the conflict brewing above it. Men built villages, raised families, tilled their soil in peace, unaware that eyes from the heights studied their every step. They did not know that their lives were the stage of a cosmic drama, where guardians wrestled not with swords, but with desire. Every sunrise saw the watchers holding their posts, but every sunset deepened the weight within their immortal hearts. For beauty, once seen, cannot be unseen, and the children of men carried a charm that heaven's fire was never meant to embrace. Thus, the celestial summons became more than a mission. It became a doorway to temptation, the first fracture in the harmony between heaven and earth. The watchers stood upon holy ground, yet their thoughts drifted into forbidden valleys. What began as vigilance would soon give birth to rebellion, and what was sent to guard would one day betray. For when heaven bends too low to the earth, the light itself may cast the longest shadow, and the shadow of the watchers was only beginning to fall. They watched first as guardians and witnesses, poised upon ridgelines where the wind combed the grass like a harp, and the dusk braided gold into the rivers. There the watchers beheld the daughters of men moving through the fields with baskets and laughter, their faces lit by hearthfire and moonlight. Beauty, which had always been a word of heaven, now wore a mortal face and breathed a mortal breath. Something new passed through the angels like a hush before a storm, tender, perilous, unnamed. The vow to remain only eyes and flame trembled, thin as a cobweb in rising heat. Desire did not arrive as a trumpet, but as a slow turning of the heart toward warmth. They saw hands washing linen in the stream, hair loosened by evening, songs that braided hope to sorrow in a language older than war. The watchers, born of fire, felt within their brightness a soft gravity drawing them downward. What had been duty became wonder. What had been distance grew intimate. Love is not sin, yet love unmoored from obedience grows fangs. The angels felt those fangs press lightly, promising honey, tasting of ash. They recalled the decree that circled them like a ring of light. Observe, protect, do not interfere. Still their thoughts lingered. Curiosity rehearsed tenderness, tenderness rehearsed longing. They spoke little, but their silence thickened with meanings they did not name. Every evening set the sky aflame, and in that flame their restraint thinned. To look was allowed. To yearn was not commanded. Between the two ran a narrow ridge, icy and steep, and their feet began to slip. The first fall is always imagined before it is lived. One of them, older in glory and stronger in voice, searched his own heart and found there a gate unguarded. He whispered not command but suggestion, a feather laid upon water, and the ripple carried through the ranks. Why should beauty be made if not to be embraced? Why should tenderness be shown if not to be answered? Words like these wore the clothing of wisdom while hiding the blade. They agreed to nothing, yet. But agreement grows in the soil of shared glances, and the night knows how to water such seeds. Below, the daughters of men wove garments and futures, unaware of the peril braided into admiration from above. They grieved and hoped, they married and sang. They blessed newborns and buried elders, and in all of it there was a holiness of dust the angels had never tasted. The watchers mistook holiness for invitation. They mistook compassion for permission. Mortal hearts, blazing and brief, became constellations to them, and the sky itself seemed to lean lower, as if the stars wished to learn the names whispered by firesides. The heavens gave warning, not with thunder, but with a thinning of song around the throne. Some lights dimmed in sorrow, as if they saw from far away the fracture forming. Dreams troubled the purer among the host. They woke with their wings cold and their mouths tasting of iron. Yet the lure below answered every chill with warmth, every fear with sweetness. The watchers grew divided inside themselves, half flame, half flesh in longing only, not yet in deed. The border between gaze and grasp flickered, a veil the night winds kept lifting. Thus desire matured, gaining teeth and vows within it that had not yet been spoken. The ridge where they stood narrowed until it became a blade, and still they walked it, eyes on the valleys where lamp smoke rose like prayers. No trumpet called them downward, their own hearts did. And somewhere to the north, where stones remember oaths and high air, steals the breath from rash words, a mountain waited for footprints and promises. The wind gathered, the stars held their breath, and the watchers leaned toward the dark like sparks searching for tinder. On the slopes of Herman, where clouds draped the peaks like veils, The watchers gathered in silence. Their wings folded close, their eyes aflame with an unrest they could no longer smother. The mountain stood as a witness, ancient stone carved by storms, waiting for oaths that would twist the course of creation. In that high place the air thinned, and with each breath they drew, the boundary between heaven and earth felt weaker. What began as whispers of longing had become a fire demanding covenant. One voice, strong as a blade drawn from its sheath, rose above the rest. It was not the voice of a king, but of an angel who carried within him both fire and hunger. He spoke of freedom disguised as destiny, of desire wrapped in boldness. Why hesitate when the longing is already alive within us? He pressed. His words found echoes in the hearts of the others, for what burns in one flame easily leaps to another. The pact took form in the trembling silence, an unspoken union seeking only to be sealed. Yet fear coiled among them, not fear of man, but of the eternal. They knew his command, they knew his warning. Still, the lure of mortal beauty outweighed the weight of heaven's decree. One after another, their hesitation melted into agreement. It was there, beneath the vast gaze of stars, that they swore together a vow. If one should fall, all would descend. None would abandon the others, for rebellion shared is rebellion emboldened. The stones of Herman drank their oath, and the mountain itself seemed to shiver at the weight of it. Their covenant was not written in scrolls, nor carved into tablets of law, but bound in the fire of their own defiance. They stood shoulder to shoulder, radiant as lightning, yet inwardly darkening. What had begun as duty had become desire. What had begun as vigilance had become conspiracy. The heavens above remained unchanged, still glittering with untouched purity. But below the surface of their vow, the first fracture cracked through eternity's order. The watchers of men had become conspirators of rebellion. The air trembled, as if creation itself recoiled. For this oath was no mere agreement of words. It was the chaining of destiny. When angels unite in will, the ripple reaches across realms. Their vow did not remain bound to Herman. It stretched into the valleys, into the cities, into the wombs of women who did not yet know the shadow approaching. Already, the balance wavered. Already the future shook with footsteps not yet born. The pact had been sealed, and the silence of heaven bore witness. They descended in the nights that followed, clothed in light, but driven by longing. They approached the daughters of men, not as distant guardians, but as suitors of forbidden union. Some came with words that dazzled, some with beauty too radiant to resist, some with promises that dripped like honey yet stung like venom. The earth, unaware of the crime unfolding, received them as wonders. For who could imagine that the shining ones had traded obedience for desire? Thus the secret pact became flesh, and the mountain that had swallowed their oath would one day echo with the cries of judgment. For rebellion clothed in love is still rebellion, and the seed planted that night would rise as giants. The covenant of Herman was not forgotten, nor hidden. It was etched into the bones of creation itself. And from that hidden fire would emerge a storm that no man, no king, no empire could resist. The earth trembled not with earthquakes, but with footsteps that did not belong to mortals alone. From the peaks of Herman, the watchers descended into valleys and villages, clothed not in terror, but in splendor, appearing to the daughters of men as beings of impossible beauty. Their faces glowed with light stolen from eternity. Their voices resonated like instruments tuned by heaven itself. They came not with swords nor with threats, but with longing disguised as love, and the hearts of women, unguarded and unknowing, opened wide to the forbidden embrace. Homes once filled with ordinary laughter now held mysteries cloaked in twilight. Women whispered of visitors who arrived like stars falling through the night, who touched the earth, yet carried the fragrance of realms beyond. Some trembled in fear, others in wonder, but few could resist the allure of eyes that had seen creation itself. These unions, profane and unholy, were not mere encounters of passion. They were fusions of light with clay, fire with flesh, eternity with mortality. The line set by the Creator blurred, and where boundaries collapse, consequences soon awaken. Pregnancy, once a song of blessing, became a foreboding silence. The wombs of women swelled not with children of men, but with the weight of something vast, something monstrous. Night after night, cries of birth echoed across villages, and with each cry the earth felt the tremor of beings larger, fiercer, hungrier than men could comprehend. The women, fragile vessels of divine defiance, carried within them the seeds of a new race, the Nephilim, destined to stride across the land as giants among mortals. The men of the earth looked upon these unions with dread. Some raised weapons against the shining intruders, but no blade could pierce the flesh of those who walked between realms. Fathers wept as their daughters vanished into the arms of the Watchers, powerless against the radiance that cloaked rebellion. Mothers tore their garments as their sons were overshadowed by colossi birthed in blood and shadow. The village fires burned lower, and the night grew longer, for no man could undo what heaven's fire had mingled with human flesh. The Watchers reveled in their defiance, each union another nail driven into the coffin of obedience. They took wives, many wives, and taught them secrets not meant for mortal hands. The fragrance of incense mingled with the stench of sacrifice as knowledge of hidden arts began to flow like poison from the lips of the fallen. Yet it was not knowledge alone that marked this rebellion. It was life itself, reshaped and perverted. For the children that emerged were not merely men nor merely angels, but something neither heaven nor earth was meant to contain. Whispers spread across the land of towering figures that grew too quickly, whose appetites devoured crops before harvest, whose hands crushed stones as if they were clay. They were the first shadows of a storm that would engulf the world. But before the terror of their strength could be fully unleashed, the sin itself lingered like smoke upon the earth, the unholy joining of what was meant to remain forever apart. Heaven and earth had kissed in rebellion, and from that kiss rose fire. Thus, the profane union sealed the fate of both the Watchers and mankind. The daughters of men bore the cost of passion wrapped in radiance, their tears staining the soil that would soon tremble beneath the march of giants. The Watchers, once guardians of innocence, had become fathers of corruption. And the earth itself, once quiet beneath the stars, now carried within its womb the weight of creatures whose very existence was a cry against the order of the eternal. The first cries did not sound like the voices of infants, but like wind torn through canyon stone. Houses shuddered under the weight of labor, and midwives fled when the shadows on the walls grew larger than the mothers who cast them. The children of the Union arrived with eyes that remembered lightning and hands that reached for the world as if it were already theirs. Blood cooled too slowly on the floor. Lamps guttered as if starved of air. In the doorway stood fathers who could not enter, listening to new lungs claim dominion over breath itself. Growth came upon them like a storm that refuses to pass. What should take seasons unfolded in a handful of dawns. Limbs lengthened, shoulders widened, bones sang against their own strength. Their laughter shook rafters, their steps cracked the hard ground. They learned without being taught, a memory stitched into their sinew from the other side of heaven's veil. Names were given to them, but the names did not fit. They outgrew every syllable, every hope. The earth felt smaller whenever they stood. Hunger arrived with their strength, and hunger was their gospel. It began with harvest baskets emptied before they reached the granaries, then with flocks counted at dusk and found missing by morning. When bread failed them, they gnawed bark from trees and sucked marrow from bones. When beasts failed them, men became prey. The mothers who had sung lullabies now lowered their eyes in fear. The fathers who sharpened iron found the edges blunted by hands that treated steel like reed. Hunger argued for cruelty and won. They wrestled with stones for sport and split them like loaves. Rivers that turned mills bent around their ankles. Torrents that would drown men rose only to their knees. They mocked walls, pressed gates from hinges, lifted the ox carts that once carried them as bundles. When they laughed together, Birds rose from fields in a cloud of panic. When they quarreled, hillsides slid. Villages learned to fall silent before dusk and hide their fires beneath pots, praying smoke would not betray their breath to the roaming giants. Some bore marks that betrayed their father's craft, eyes that mirrored constellations, sinews threaded with a faint, unearthly glow, scars that healed before the blood had time to dry. They spoke thunder in low voices and told stories of dreams where seas bowed and mountains leaned. The elders, who once settled disputes with proverbs, now offered tribute instead of counsel. With every new dawn, the line between myth and morning chores faded, and storytellers felt their tongues grow heavy with caution. Mothers who had carried the rebellion in their wombs walked the edges of towns like ghosts, torn between love and dread. They recognized in the tilt of a jaw the memory of an angel's smile, and in the flare of a temper the stamp of fire that could not be cooled. Songs ceased at wells. Children learned to count fear by the distance between drumbeats in their chests. The Nephilim did not ask for thrones. They stood and the ground served them. They reached and the world yielded. They desired and someone paid. Thus the earth learned a new calendar, not of months and harvests, but of footfalls and feasts taken by force. Fields lay bare, flocks thinned to bone, and granaries echoed like tombs. The giants turned their faces toward the roads that threaded cities together, and the roads seemed to rise in welcome. Where hunger walks with strength, dominion soon follows, and the drums that once called to weddings began to measure the pace of marching. The horizon darkened beneath their silhouettes, and nations felt the first tug of a yoke not yet named. The giants did not arrive as kings crowned with gold, yet wherever they walked, thrones toppled and rulers bowed. Their height alone commanded reverence, but it was not only their stature that enslaved nations, it was the aura of dread that wrapped them like storm clouds. Villages fell silent when they passed. Warriors who once boasted of conquest now lowered their swords. The Nephilim carried with them a dominion that no man granted, yet all men yielded. In their shadows, the proud learned the taste of dust. Cities that had once blossomed through trade and alliance now trembled beneath their gaze. The giants demanded food and drink in measures no harvest could sustain, and what could not be given was taken with violence. Stone walls that had withstood armies crumbled under their fists. Gates splintered like twigs before their steps. They seized the choicest lands, claiming rivers, valleys, and mountains as their playgrounds. No council of elders could restrain them, no priest could curse them into retreat. The world became a map redrawn by their hunger and might. The kings of men, once arbiters of justice, became servants to colossi they could not oppose. Some sought to placate them with offerings of cattle, grain, and even daughters, hoping to turn wrath into favor. Others tried alliances, believing that if a giant bore their banners, their enemies would flee without battle. Yet all bargains ended in ruin, for the Nephilim honored no oaths and mocked treaties as though they were children's games. Thrones became chairs for giants, crowns ornaments for their laughter, and kings were remembered not as rulers, but as slaves who signed their own surrender. Among the people, fear became a second language. Mothers hushed their children not with lullabies but with warnings. Silence, lest the giants hear. Festivals grew barren, altars abandoned, markets empty. Where laughter once echoed, silence now reigned, broken only by the rumble of footsteps that shook the ground like thunder. No city was safe, no tribe untouched. Roads became rivers of flight, families scattering into forests and caves, preferring exile to the gaze of eyes that gleamed like embers in the dark. Yet not all submission was born of terror. Some mortals, corrupted by ambition, sought the favor of the Nephilim. They bowed willingly, offering their loyalty in exchange for scraps of power. These traitors whispered secrets of their own people, guided armies at the giants' command, and shed blood for the chance to stand in the shadow of greatness. But power granted by rebellion is a poisoned gift, and those who served the Nephilim soon found themselves broken, discarded once their usefulness waned. The earth learned that those who ally with giants are crushed beneath the same heel that tramples their enemies. The land itself bore the scars of their dominion. Fields once green turned to wastelands, rivers clogged with bones, cities reduced to ruins swallowed by weeds. Smoke curled endlessly into the sky, not from altars of worship but from villages burned in sport. The horizon, once adorned with stars, seemed dimmed by the smoke of their cruelty. Time itself felt heavier, as though each day dragged humanity deeper into chains no man could escape. The dominion of the Nephilim was not a reign of order but of chaos, where every sunrise promised only further ruin. Thus the power of the giants became the curse of the earth. They did not sit upon thrones carved for kings, they sat upon the world itself, stretching their hands across nations as if the soil belonged to them. Men prayed for deliverance, but prayers rose into skies clouded with rebellion. The Nephilim, born of forbidden fire, ruled not by right nor by covenant, but by strength alone, and the earth lay beneath them like a conquered bride. Yet in the silence of heaven, where the Eternal watched, the storm of judgment was already gathering, though the giants could not yet hear its thunder. The giants did not only crush stone and earth with their steps, they also opened doors that were never meant to be touched by human hands. From their fathers, the fallen watchers, they inherited knowledge clothed in brilliance but poisoned at its root. They taught men to smelt ore into blades, to fashion iron into spears sharper than bone or flint. Blacksmiths once content with plowshares now labored in fire to forge weapons of war. The clang of metal became the new song of villages, and blood soon followed wherever that music was heard. They revealed to women secrets hidden in the stars. Patterns once admired for beauty became maps for invoking power. They traced constellations in the dust and taught names that carried chains of influence. The night sky, once a canvas of wonder, turned into a book of sorcery. With whispered chants, mortals summoned illusions, bent shadows, and sought counsel from spirits who demanded blood in return. What was given as knowledge descended into the craft of manipulation, until the line between prayer and spell dissolved. The forbidden arts did not stop at metal or stars. They taught the mixing of roots, the crafting of potions, the blending of herbs that dulled pain but opened doors to visions that were not holy. Mortals drank and saw shapes not of heaven, but of twisted echoes from the abyss. Prophets raised by the Eternal were mocked, drowned out by false seers whose tongues burned with lies gifted from their angelic teachers. The earth filled with voices, but truth grew faint beneath the storm of deceit. Adornment, once innocent, became weaponized. The watchers revealed cosmetics to heighten allure, jewelry to ensnare the gaze, charms to stir lust and bend the will. The daughters of men clothed themselves in enchantments, unaware that every painted eye and golden chain was another link in the chain of corruption. Beauty became a trap, and desire became currency. Whole families fell into ruin as the sacred bonds of marriage crumbled before the weight of temptation sanctified by forbidden knowledge. Even the ground bore witness to their rebellion. They carved signs into stone, circles of power that opened gateways for spirits who should have remained bound. Flames rose where no fire was lit, and shadows moved where no figure stood. Children grew up surrounded by whispers in the dark, their lullabies replaced by the muttering of incantations. What had once been a garden for the Creator's breath was turning into a workshop for rebellion, where men learned to stretch their hands toward powers that would devour them. Kings sought the counsel of giants, not prophets, and warriors sought charms instead of faith. Armies carried weapons that dripped with curses before they tasted blood. Temples glowed not with the fire of devotion, but with sacrifices meant to bargain with forces that mocked the Eternal. The Nephilim smiled, for every new spell, every sharpened blade, every whispered name in the night meant one more thread torn from the fabric of creation. They watched mankind poison itself, and they fed the poison gladly. Thus the earth became drenched not only in blood, but in sorcery. Knowledge, once meant to illuminate, had become a fire that scorched. The Watchers had given mortals gifts dressed as wisdom, but each gift carried chains that bound tighter with every use. The giants strode across lands armed not just with size and strength, but with the cunning of corrupted knowledge. And in the heavens, where silence waited like drawn breath, judgment edged closer. For what men called wisdom, the Eternal named defilement, and what men hailed as progress, the heavens marked as rebellion. The earth groaned beneath their steps, not only from the weight of their towering bodies, but from the appetite that burned within them like an unquenchable fire. The Nephilim, children of heaven's defiance and earth's womb, were never satisfied. What filled the barns of villages could not sustain a single one for more than a day. Wheat vanished from the threshing floors, grapes were stripped from vines, and granaries once echoing with the sound of abundance became hollow caverns of despair. Mothers wept at barren fields, fathers bent their backs to replant, yet no harvest could outrun the mouths of giants. At first they consumed what men could offer willingly. Tribute was demanded, flocks driven forward, jars of oil stacked in trembling hands, baskets of figs and dates piled at the feet of colossi. Villagers bowed their heads, hoping offerings would soothe hunger too vast for soil and season. But tribute was not enough. What began with gifts soon turned to theft, and what began with theft ended in slaughter. They tore through herds in the night, snapping the necks of cattle as if breaking reeds. They drained rivers of fish, then turned their eyes to those who had once fed them. Hunger is a tyrant crueler than any king. The giants devoured men as men once devoured bread. Warriors who dared to resist were seized and broken, their bones cracked open for marrow. Children disappeared from roads, their cries silenced beneath the shadows of titans. Cannibalism became not shame, but entertainment, a sport to feed both belly and pride. Around their feasts, firelight flickered on hands dripping with blood, and their laughter roared like storms rolling down mountains. The scent of burning flesh stained the air until even the winds carried lament. The land itself seemed to recoil. Forests stood stripped of game, rivers ran clouded with gore, hillsides once green lay trampled into barren dust. Men fled from valleys to caves, from cities to mountains, yet the Nephilim followed, their strides devouring distances in moments. No refuge was safe, no wall was high enough. The cry of humanity rose like smoke into the heavens, a sound not of prayer alone but of terror, pleas sent upward because no strength remained on earth to answer. The Watchers, their fathers, looked on with pride and ruin twined together, unwilling to repent, unable to control the very seed they had sown. The giants themselves felt the torment of hunger, even as they feasted. Their bellies filled only for a moment, before emptiness clawed at them again. It was as if their very existence demanded the undoing of creation. Every bite another thread pulled from the fabric of the world. They mocked the mortals who cowered before them, yet within their own eyes burned a restless need that no feast could quiet. Hunger had become their identity, their curse, their inheritance. To devour was to live, and yet the more they consumed, the more hollow they became. Whispers spread among survivors that the ground cried out with their crimes, that the very soil rejected the blood spilled upon it. Fields failed to yield, not from drought, but from defilement. Villages abandoned by men were haunted by echoes of feasts and screams. The Nephilim, unsated, turned even against one another, their quarrels erupting into battles that shattered cliffs and split rivers from their courses. Hunger did not unite them, it drove them into chaos, a fire consuming itself in endless frenzy. Thus, the insatiable hunger of the Nephilim marked the earth with scars deeper than wounds of war. They were not merely giants of stature, but of appetite, beings whose very breath consumed, whose very presence devoured. Their feasts were graves, their laughter dirges, their hunger a prophecy of doom. For a world that cannot feed its tyrants is a world rushing toward ruin, and heaven's silence could not last forever. Somewhere above, judgment stirred, and the cries of men climbed higher than the smoke of sacrifices, demanding an answer from the Eternal. The earth no longer resembled the garden once entrusted to man. Villages lay beneath shadows that stretched taller than their walls, and blood marked the thresholds where songs had once risen. The Nephilim ruled not only with strength, but with terror, bending kings into servants and turning cities into hunting grounds. Men no longer sowed with hope, but with dread, for what sprouted was claimed before it ripened. Women no longer sang lullabies without fear, for their children might be seized to feed the cravings of giants. Every day became a wound carved deeper into the flesh of creation. The Watchers, who once shone with the light of heaven, poured forbidden knowledge into mortal ears. They revealed the cutting of roots for sorcery, the drawing of stars for omens, the forging of blades honed beyond the skill of man. With these arts, blood spread faster and trust decayed. Men turned against men, tribes against tribes, not only because of the giants, but because of the poisoned wisdom whispered into their hearts. What had been rebellion in heaven now flowered into corruption on earth, a harvest of shadows reaped from seeds of pride. Altars rose, not to the eternal, but to shapes of stone and fire born from imagination twisted by the fallen. Incense drifted toward idols, and blood that should have sealed covenant with heaven was poured out to honor false gods. Children vanished into rituals that reeked of smoke and despair, and priests clothed in lies promised favor from spirits that mocked the Almighty. The laughter of giants mingled with the chants of sorcerers, and the world itself seemed to stagger under the weight of its own profanity. War became the language of nations. Spears rattled like thunder. Chariots carved scars into plains, and rivers ran red so often that fish died in silence. Giants waded into these battles as if into shallow streams, scattering armies with a single swing, breaking walls with their shoulders, enslaving survivors to build monuments to their pride. Mortals learned cruelty from their masters, perfecting the art of death as if it were their inheritance. The ground cried out with blood, and heaven listened as cries of the innocent rose higher than smoke. The corruption did not remain in deeds alone. It seeped into the imagination, darkening even dreams. Men longed for power more than peace. Women sought knowledge of shadows more than comfort, and children played with mockeries of violence as though it were destiny. Justice was drowned, mercy exiled, truth gagged. The world that had once been called good now reeked of betrayal, and even the animals seemed restless, their eyes reflecting the terror of a creation unraveling. The giants themselves mocked the eternal, boasting of their might, declaring that no hand could undo them. They carved their names into mountains, as if eternity could be claimed with stone. Yet within their arrogance was fear, for dreams came to them filled with fire and judgment. Still they silenced such warnings with feasts and blood, hoping to drown prophecy with the noise of their defiance. Pride thickened like armor around them, and corruption became not only their mark, but their shield. Thus, corruption reached its fullness, a world drowning in blood, enslaved by shadows, mocked by its guardians, devoured by its false kings. Humanity had become intoxicated with the very poison poured into them, blind to the abyss yawning before their feet. And in the silence between screams and wars, heaven's patience trembled, for judgment was near. For when corruption fills the cup to overflowing, only the hand of the Eternal can tip it, and the flood of his justice cannot be stopped. Amid the thunder of giants and the silence of corrupted altars, there still flickered a remnant, small as a candle fighting the wind. Not all bowed to idols, nor bent to the will of the Nephilim. Scattered across valleys and hills, lived men and women whose hearts clung to the memory of the Eternal. They whispered prayers in caves, sang hymns under the cover of night, and raised trembling hands toward a heaven they could no longer see but still believed would answer. Their voices, though few, rose like arrows piercing the darkness. Fathers hid their children when the giants passed, but in the stillness of night, they lifted them before the Eternal in desperate supplication. Mothers, broken by hunger and grief, still taught the names of God to lips barely able to form words. Farmers offered not only their harvest, but their tears upon hidden altars, asking for protection from a world devoured by violence. These prayers, soaked in fear yet anchored in faith, rose higher than the smoke of bloodied sacrifices given to false gods. It was the cry of innocence crushed under tyranny, yet refusing to be silenced. The angels who had not fallen bent their ears toward the earth, grieving at what their brethren had unleashed. They carried the petitions of the faithful before the throne, where incense and lament mingled. Each plea carried weight: the plea of a widow whose children had been taken, the groan of a man who had lost his land, the whispered hope of a youth hiding in the ruins of his village. Heaven gathered them, drop by drop, until the bowl of suffering trembled, ready to overflow. The cries themselves became weapons, not of steel nor fire, but of endurance that pierced the arrogance of giants. The Nephilim mocked these prayers, laughing as they trampled altars and shattered the dwellings of the weak. But every time blood touched the earth, every time a voice called upward in defiance of despair, it reached the eternal. What giants devoured, heaven recorded. What tyrants mocked, the Almighty preserved. Nothing escaped his gaze, and the cries of the faithful were louder than the feasts of the mighty. Dreams carried warnings among the righteous, visions of waters rising, of fire descending, of mountains trembling at the approach of judgment. Some wept at these revelations, others clung to them as promises of deliverance. The righteous were not many, yet they became the thread holding the earth from total collapse. Their trust, though fragile, became the channel through which mercy would descend even in the midst of wrath. For while corruption filled the earth, heaven's attention rested on the voices that still remembered his name. The giants felt this unseen resistance, though they could not name it. Their feasts soured, their victories tasted of ash, for no matter how much they conquered, the quiet persistence of the righteous gnawed at them like an invisible flame. They mocked louder, sinned bolder, but within their pride echoed unease. For even Colossi cannot silence the trembling of creation when it aligns with the prayers of the faithful. Every whisper carried more weight than their shouts, every tear more power than their weapons. Thus, the cries of the righteous ascended as a chorus of grief and hope, echoing louder than the roars of rebellion. It was a sound the Eternal could not ignore, for he is near to the brokenhearted and hears the groans of the oppressed. And while the earth drowned in corruption, these voices became the trumpet that summoned judgment. For heaven listens, even when the world does not, and justice always stirs when innocence pleads for its defender. Among the chaos, one man walked with God as a friend walks with another. His name was Enoch, a mortal born of dust, yet chosen to behold what no eye of man had seen. While the giants thundered across the plains and the cries of the righteous pierced the skies, Enoch's heart burned with a clarity that set him apart. He was not clothed in strength nor armed with weapons, but in purity that shone brighter than iron. When he prayed, silence bent to listen, and when he spoke, even shadows seemed to pause. One night, as the heavens blazed with countless stars, a great trembling passed through his spirit. The air thickened, heavy with light, and suddenly the veil of earth was torn away. Angels brighter than dawn lifted him, their wings beating with the sound of rushing waters. Higher and higher he was carried, past clouds and constellations, until the very throne of the Eternal came into view. There, wrapped in fire and majesty, sat the One who governs all. Rivers of flame poured from his presence, and yet Enoch did not perish, for he was held by mercy. Before him unfolded visions that no language of man could fully contain. He saw the chambers of heaven where books were opened, recording every deed, every cry, every drop of blood spilled upon the earth. He beheld the watchers chained in their guilt, trembling before a judgment not yet delivered. He saw the Nephilim, their laughter turning to dread as dreams of destruction devoured their sleep. The future unfurled like a scroll, each scene sharper than the last, revealing the destiny of both rebels and faithful. The Eternal's voice, like thunder that carries both terror and comfort, spoke to Enoch. He was shown the measure of days, the boundaries of mercy, and the certainty of wrath. The Watchers who had corrupted mankind would be cast into pits of shadow, bound until the final judgment. Their sons, the giants, would not escape the sentence written against them, for their existence itself defiled creation. Yet amid judgment, a promise glowed like gold within fire. The righteous would not be forgotten, and through one man's line, salvation would endure. Enoch trembled, not in despair but in awe. He saw rivers swelling beyond their banks, waters prepared as a weapon sharper than swords. He beheld armies of angels girded for battle, their ranks endless as the stars. He saw fire coiled above the earth like lightning waiting to strike. Yet he also glimpsed a rainbow, a sign of covenant that would rise after the storm. The Eternal revealed not only destruction, but the hope hidden beyond it, a legacy that would remain long after giants had turned to dust. When Enoch was returned to the earth, his eyes still carried the reflection of what he had seen. Men who looked upon him felt the weight of another world in his gaze. He spoke little of his visions, for words could not contain them, but when he did, his voice trembled with the gravity of eternity. He warned, he pleaded, he reminded men that corruption does not escape heaven's notice. Some mocked him, others wept, but all felt the truth pressing upon them like a storm that could not be delayed. Thus, Enoch became a living testimony, a bridge between heaven and earth. Through him, mortals glimpsed the fury of judgment and the beauty of mercy. His visions were not merely for his generation, but for every age that would follow, a record of heaven's justice and faithfulness. And though he walked again among men, part of him never returned. His spirit remained tethered to the throne he had seen, carrying within it the certainty that the Eternal does not forget, and his judgment always arrives on time. The vision entrusted to Enoch did not remain hidden in the silence of his heart. The Eternal had chosen him as a messenger, and what he had seen before the throne burned within him until it was spoken aloud. When the angels who had descended looked upon him, their confidence faltered, for they recognized in his eyes the fire of heaven's judgment. He bore no sword, no weapon, and yet his words would cut sharper than any blade. The time of secrecy had ended. What had been rebellion in shadows was now dragged into light, and the verdict of eternity pressed down upon the guilty. The Eternal's decree rang out like thunder over mountains, echoing through realms seen and unseen. To the Watchers who had abandoned their place of holiness, the sentence was chains of darkness, bonds forged not of iron but of judgment itself. They would be cast into pits deep beneath the earth, sealed away until the great day of reckoning. Their brilliance, once radiant as stars, would be cloaked in shadow. Their voices, once filled with songs, would echo only with regret. The glory they traded for desire had become their prison, and no plea could overturn the verdict spoken by the Almighty. But the judgment did not stop with the fathers. The children they had begotten, the giants who filled the earth with violence, who devoured flesh and mocked the Creator, were condemned to perish. Their bodies, vast as mountains, would be broken by sword, fire, and flood. Yet their spirits, twisted and restless, would not return to heaven nor descend fully into Sheol. Instead, they would wander as shadows upon the earth, cursed as evil spirits, tormenting mankind until the final end. The very breath of their rebellion would haunt generations yet unborn, a perpetual reminder of heaven's broken order. Enoch's lips trembled as he delivered this message, but his voice did not falter. To the Watchers he declared their doom, and their eyes, once filled with pride, sank in dread. To the giants he foretold their downfall, and though they roared with defiance, a shiver of fear rippled through their monstrous forms. Men who heard him were struck with awe, for though he stood among them as a mortal, he carried the authority of the Eternal. His words spread like fire carried by the wind, whispered in villages, chanted in secret gatherings, feared in courts of kings. The watchers raged in silence, knowing no weapon of theirs could undo the decree. Some begged Enoch to intercede, to plead for mercy on their behalf, but he shook his head with sorrow. "The sentence is sealed," he told them, "for your choices have bound you more tightly than chains. What was holy you profaned, what was entrusted you betrayed, and now the measure of your deeds is full." The heavens bore witness, the earth groaned beneath its corruption, and the decree stood like an immovable mountain. Judgment was not only promised, it was already unfolding. In the days that followed, the Nephilim's dreams grew darker. They saw rivers of blood swallowing plains, skies burning with fire, and oceans rising like walls. Though they mocked outwardly, their nights were haunted by visions of their own destruction. What they laughed at in daylight consumed them in shadows, for prophecy does not fade, it multiplies. Fathers turned their faces from sons, warriors trembled before unseen terror, and mothers wept, knowing their children were born not for glory, but for doom. Thus the divine sentence marked the turning of ages. Heaven had spoken, and its decree could not be recalled. The watchers were condemned to darkness, their sons to destruction, and the earth to cleansing by the wrath of the Eternal. Yet amid judgment, the righteous found a strange comfort. Their cries had been heard, their suffering had not been ignored. For if justice was falling upon the mighty, then deliverance was rising for the humble. And in that balance, the story of creation bent toward a reckoning that no rebellion could withstand. The message of judgment was not left in visions alone, for the Eternal commanded Enoch to speak directly to the fallen ones. With trembling steps, yet a heart burning with divine authority, he approached the watchers in the valleys, where they had hidden themselves from men. They had once descended in brilliance, but now their radiance was stained with shame, their wings weighed down by dread. They waited for him not with honor, but with desperation, for in his presence they felt the gravity of heaven's decree pressing against their souls. Enoch lifted his voice, and though he was a man of dust, his words carried the resonance of eternity. "You were set as guardians," he declared, "watchers over the children of men, to guide them, to protect them, to keep the order of creation. But you abandoned your holy station, and with lust you defiled the daughters of earth. You taught men secrets not meant for their hands, and your pride has filled the world with blood. The decree has been sealed, chains of darkness await you, until the day when judgment burns without end." His words struck like lightning against a storm-dark sky. The watchers trembled. Their leader, who once had spoken with confidence upon Mount Herman, now bowed his head, unable to meet the gaze of the messenger. They pleaded, their voices mingling sorrow and rebellion. "Will there be no mercy? Will no intercession rise for us?" But Enoch shook his head, for the verdict of the Eternal cannot be overturned by the prayers of the guilty. Their rebellion was not a wound of weakness, but a choice of defiance, and their tears came too late. The law of heaven had spoken, and their sentence stood unshaken. The Nephilim, towering and restless, drew near to hear his words. Though they towered above him like mountains, their steps faltered at the sound of their doom. They laughed to cloak their fear, mocking his frailty, but behind their laughter was dread. For even giants know when prophecy binds them, and the weight of destiny pressed heavy upon their shoulders. Their feasts tasted of ash, their battles rang hollow, for every victory was already poisoned with the knowledge of their approaching fall. Enoch did not speak in hatred, but in sorrow. His eyes carried the grief of one who had seen the face of the Eternal, who understood both justice and mercy. "You were made for glory," he told them, "but you traded it for shadows. You were trusted with light, but you chose darkness. And now, the very creation you corrupted cries out against you. The waters are rising, the fire is kindled, the sword is drawn. Turn your eyes to the heavens you abandoned, for though your plea will not erase your guilt, it may yet teach men that the Eternal is just." The watchers wept, not with repentance, but with regret. They remembered the throne they had left, the songs they had forsaken, the glory they had cast aside for the fleeting beauty of mortal flesh. Their tears watered the ground, but the earth would not forgive them. Their cries rose into the air, but heaven remained silent. For judgment is not delayed forever, and their time had already run its course. Thus the warning was delivered, echoing from Enoch's lips into the fabric of creation itself. It was not only a message to the fallen, but a testimony to mankind, that no rebellion escapes the gaze of the eternal, and no pride remains unbroken. The watchers had heard their fate. The giants had felt the chill of their coming doom. And though they raged and resisted, the shadow of judgment grew longer with every passing day, for the hand of heaven was already moving toward the earth. The giants, once roaring in pride and terror, began to feel the weight of a silence heavier than chains. Their nights were no longer filled with drunken laughter or the echo of feasts, but with dreams that clawed at their hearts. They saw fire pouring from the skies, waters swallowing cities, and their own towering bodies collapsing into dust. In sleep, they wrestled with visions they could not conquer, and in waking, they carried dread that no weapon could slay. Their boastful voices cracked into murmurs, and the earth trembled not with their strength, but with their fear. Around their campfires, where once blood and wine mingled in arrogant revelry, their words became confessions. They spoke of omens in the stars, of whispers in the wind, of shadows that pursued them even when they walked beneath the sun. Their laughter turned hollow, for every feast tasted like ash, every victory rang like a funeral bell. They looked upon one another, seeing not gods among men, but cursed children of rebellion, destined to fade. For the first time, the Nephilim understood they were not eternal. Their might could not outlive the decree written against them. Mothers of giants, mortal women who had carried the rebellion in their wombs, wept as they listened to their sons groan in despair. They remembered when those voices had been infant cries, when their eyes had glowed with an innocence untainted by defiance. Now those same eyes carried storms, and those cries had become laments that shook valleys. They tried to comfort them, but what comfort could stand against the hand of heaven? Their lullabies withered in their throats, for what child of man could soothe the grief of a fallen angel's offspring? The giants turned their faces toward the heavens, calling not with defiance but with desperation. Their voices rolled like thunder across the plains. Why were we born if only for ruin? Why did heaven allow us breath if only to take it away? They demanded answers, but none came. The sky above remained silent, the stars indifferent to their cries. They were creations of defiance, and defiance cannot appeal to the justice it has mocked. Their voices rose higher, but the silence was heavier still, pressing them into despair. Some sought to fight fate, sharpening blades and building fortresses of stone. They swore they would resist even the Almighty, that no flood nor fire would erase their names. But deep within their souls, the visions returned, louder and clearer. Walls crumbled in their dreams, swords shattered like glass, and their strength dissolved like mist before the sun. Others fell into madness, wandering into deserts, tearing at their own flesh, howling against the winds. Fear became their true master, and their lament grew louder than their war cries. Even the earth seemed to mock them. Rivers they once drank, dry ran red with omens. Forests where they hunted grew barren, and skies that once brightened their triumphs turned black with storms. Nature itself recoiled from them, bearing witness to their corruption. They were too great for men, but too corrupt for creation, caught in a space where neither heaven nor earth would claim them. Their lament was not only sorrow, but an echo of cosmic rejection, a sound that made even mortals tremble, for it carried the weight of doom. Thus the lament of the giants spread like a plague, reaching every mountain, every valley, every city they had once ruled. Their voices, once symbols of terror, became dirges of despair. The Nephilim, who had seemed indestructible, revealed their weakness, not in battle, but in the haunting knowledge of their end. And though they raged, though they wept, though they cried out to the heavens, no answer came. For judgment had already been written, and their laments were but the drums that announced its approach. They gathered where the winds gnaw the ridges of Herman, a convocation of fallen brightness and their towering suns. Pride had cracked into panic, and panic into naked begging. The watchers, whose eyes once carried dawn, now could not lift their gaze above the dust. The Nephilim, who made men kneel, bent their own massive knees until rock bit skin. Their voices rolled like storms over stone as they cried to the Eternal for pardon, not with the swagger of kings, but with the thin breath of the condemned. They promised restraint. They promised repair. They promised what rebellion never keeps. They tried to braid their pleas into liturgy, carving petitions into rock as if words etched in stone could climb to heaven. They sent their cries along the old paths of thunder, promising to unteach what they had taught, to close the wounds they had opened, to bind their appetites with shackles of will. The air trembled with oaths, the trees shivered as if winter had crept into summer. But the sky above them wore iron. No answer pressed back through the blue. Their prayers rose and unraveled, like smoke torn thin by indifferent wind. The giants brought offerings with hands that had only known taking. They stacked grain stolen from starving fields, laid down iron they had forced from screaming earth, and poured wine darker than truth upon blackened stones. Some released captives they had kept in caves. Some broke blades and buried them where roots might claim the metal back. Mothers came with them, hair unbound, carrying the names of their sons like embers in their mouths. The ground accepted the weight of gifts, but not the guilt they carried. Altars smoldered. Mercy did not descend. Night after night, their laments deepened. The mortal women who had borne them stood apart, faces veiled with ash, fingers pressed to lips to keep from breaking under grief. They prayed in the small language of human sorrow, the language that heaven loves. Yet even their tears found the edge of judgment and could not pass it. The silence that answered was not neglect. It was verdict. What had been for long seasons of patience now hardened like cooled lava. A decree set, a path chosen, a door that would not open to hands that had broken it from the hinges. Dreams returned, heavier than chains. In sleep they stood before a scroll blazing with certainty, and a hand they could not see traced lines of fire across their names. They asked for a sign. The sign was distance. They asked for a voice. The voice was thunder too far to decipher. Mercy does not vanish, but it can close its window for a season, and that season had arrived. The watchers remembered the music around the throne and found the memory a blade. The giants remembered the first day they drew breath and tasted ash. Some sought to repent by starving, but hunger rose like a serpent and coiled around their resolve. Some swore to die rather than devour, then woke with red at their mouths and no memory between oath and dawn. Their own nature argued against them, and they lost the argument. Rage followed shame, and shame followed rage, until they turned on one another in quarrels that split cliffs. The Nephilim blamed the Watchers for making them. The Watchers blamed desire for unmaking them, and the earth bore both quarrel and blame without granting relief. Enoch stood once more before them, a thin man with the weight of heaven in his voice. He did not gloat. He did not soften. "The sentence is fixed," he said, "and even my tears cannot move it. You asked for a door. You shattered its frame. You asked for a river. You poisoned its spring. Now listen to the hush behind the hush." They listened, and in that vast quiet, they heard a distant trembling, not an answer, but an approach. Deep places began to stir. Birds lifted early from their nests. Clouds thickened with a pregnant gravity, and far beneath the roots of mountains, something like a heartbeat counted down the moments left to plead. The silence that followed the pleas of the watchers and the lament of their sons was heavier than stone. Heaven had listened, but heaven did not bend. Then came the voice of the Eternal, not carried by wind nor thunder, but burning through the fabric of creation itself. It spoke with the weight of mountains and the sharpness of fire. The decree was final. The rebellion would not be pardoned. The corruption would not be excused. Justice had been stirred from its chamber, and mercy had stepped aside for judgment to take its throne. The command rolled like a tide through the heavens. Angels who had remained faithful felt their wings tremble as the words reached them. They girded themselves like warriors preparing for battle, for the Eternal had spoken of cleansing, of punishment, of reckoning. They saw in their visions waters swelling beyond their banks, fires kindling in the deep, swords gleaming with holy light. The decree was not only against the Watchers and their offspring, but against the world that had been soaked in their corruption. Every drop of innocent blood cried for recompense, and every cry would be answered. To the Watchers, the sentence was chains thicker than despair, forged in the abyss itself. They would be hurled into caverns of darkness, bound until the great day of judgment, when even their shadows would be burned away. No song would rise from their lips again, no glory would crown their brows. What they had traded for desire would now be their dungeon, and the memory of heaven would become their torment. Their brilliance was extinguished, and their names became curses among men. To the Nephilim, the decree was annihilation. Their bodies, vast as mountains, would fall like trees beneath the axe. Their roars would become screams, and their feasts would end in famine. Yet their spirits would not find rest. They would linger as wraiths, foul and restless, sowing terror among men until the end of days. Thus, the earth would inherit a shadow it had not chosen, the wandering spirits of giants, birthed from rebellion, chained to corruption. This curse would echo through generations, a reminder of what happens when heaven and earth are joined in defiance. The decree reached the ears of men as whispers carried by prophets, as visions carved into their sleep. They awoke, trembling, for the certainty of doom pressed upon their hearts. Some wept, others repented, but many mocked still, blinded by the intoxication of corruption. Yet whether believed or denied, the word of the Eternal stood immovable, like a mountain unshaken by storms. The decree was not subject to counsel, nor open to debate. It was as fixed as the stars, as sure as dawn. Enoch himself felt the decree burn within him like fire shut up in his bones. He carried it back to men, to kings, to priests, to shepherds hiding in caves. His voice shook as he declared that the Eternal had set his face against corruption, and no power in heaven or earth could delay his hand. Men who laughed at him by day saw visions by night that robbed them of their rest. The earth itself seemed to groan under the sentence, as if rivers, mountains, and skies already prepared to obey the word of the Most High. Thus, the decree was sealed, and all creation held its breath. The Watchers trembled in dread, the Nephilim raged in futility, men whispered in terror, and heaven readied its hosts. The words of the Eternal were not empty, they were execution. And once spoken, they began to move like arrows loosed from a bow, flying swift, straight, unstoppable. The decree of the Most High had fallen, and the world itself would soon break beneath its weight. When the world was drowning in corruption, when violence choked the breath of every city and the cries of innocence were swallowed by the laughter of giants, one man stood like an unbroken pillar against the flood of sin. His name was Noah. He was not mighty in stature, nor crowned with earthly power, but his heart beat in rhythm with the Eternal. Where others mocked, he prayed. Where others feasted on blood, he sought purity. In the midst of chaos, his life became an altar, and his footsteps a testimony that light could still shine even when the earth was smothered in shadow. From his youth, Noah carried a strangeness that set him apart. He walked with reverence when others ran toward ruin. He guarded his family with faith, teaching them to honor the Creator, even while neighbors bowed to idols. His hands built altars instead of weapons. His lips carried blessings instead of curses. The corruption around him pressed in like floodwaters, yet it never breached the walls of his spirit. Heaven's eyes roamed the earth and found in him a vessel worthy of mercy, a man who could bear the weight of covenant when all else had shattered. The Eternal spoke to him not in thunder, but in certainty, a whisper stronger than armies, a vision heavier than mountains. "You have found favor in my sight," declared the voice that had shaped worlds. The words burned into Noah's heart, sealing him as chosen. While nations gave their loyalty to giants and their altars to demons, heaven gave its trust to one man of clay. The decree of destruction had already been spoken, but in Noah, the Eternal planted the seed of survival. Judgment would fall, yet hope would rise through his obedience. Noah felt the burden of this call press upon his shoulders. It was not a crown of honor, but a mantle of sorrow. He looked upon neighbors who mocked his devotion, upon relatives who had surrendered to corruption, and he knew that the storm coming would spare none but his house. His heart wept, yet his resolve did not falter. He obeyed not because it was easy, but because obedience is stronger than fear. Where others hardened their hearts, his bent in submission. Where others rebelled, he listened. And in listening, he became the hinge upon which history would turn. The giants despised him. They mocked his prayers, laughed at his purity, ridiculed his refusal to bow before them. Yet within their mockery was unease, for even their dreams whispered of his role. The watchers looked upon him with dread, for his very existence testified that obedience could still survive in flesh. Noah was a mirror they could not bear to face, reflecting the holiness they had abandoned. Though he walked as a simple man, his steps thundered louder than their armies, for they carried the weight of the Eternal's choice. His family, too, was gathered beneath heaven's protection, not because they were flawless, but because they were bound to him. His wife, his sons, and their wives would share in the ark of mercy prepared for him. Their survival was tethered to his faith, their future to his obedience. While the earth prepared itself for ruin, Noah prepared himself for trust. His household became a sanctuary in a world drowning in filth, the last flicker of covenant in an age bent on destruction. Thus, Noah was chosen, not for his might nor his wealth, but for his heart that remained uncorrupted when all else was defiled. He became the line through which creation would begin anew, the bearer of covenant, the builder of salvation's vessel. The Eternal had spoken, and his choice was fixed. Amid giants and rebels, sorcerers and kings, one man's name was lifted by heaven as the seed of survival. And though the flood had not yet risen, its shadow already darkened the horizon, pressing Noah to prepare for a storm that would wash the world clean. Night thickened, as if the sky itself mourned, and in that heavy dark, the decree became movement. From the high paths where light is born, ranks of loyal angels descended, not in spectacle, but in purpose. Their armor shone without glare, their faces carried neither rage nor pity, only obedience tempered like steel. They did not argue with the fallen. They did not trade words for wounds. They came to bind what had unbound the earth, to seal what had broken the order, to carry rebellion to the caverns appointed for it since the first whisper of defiance. The watchers felt them before they saw them, a pressure like deep water pressing on the lungs. Those who had once descended in glory tried to cloak themselves in splendor again. But borrowed light cannot survive the dawn. Their wings, heavy with shame, would not rise. Their voices, once sweet with song, cracked into ash. They looked for mountains to hide them, for clouds to cover them, yet the very elements refused their plea. Herman, witness to oath and treachery, gave no shelter. The wind, which had carried secrets, now carried summons. Enoch stood at the edge of the valley, thin as a reed, and watched duty take form. He did not rejoice, he did not plead. He remembered the throne that had sent this judgment and the people whose cries had filled its courts. The faithful host drew near like the tide, and the first of the chains appeared, links not hammered by hands, but woven from decree, sentences braided into iron, justice forged into weight. When they fell upon the fallen, the ground itself rang, and the mountains answered like drums struck by invisible hands. Some among the watchers attempted to resist, calling flame into their palms, drawing ancient names into the air. The names dissolved. The flame curled back, ashamed to serve them. They reached for the strength that had once opened the sky and found only memory. Then fear stripped them of speech. Bound wrist to wing, wing to shoulder, shoulder to heart, they were pressed into lines that led downward. The loyal did not strike them, the chains did. Each link pronounced a truth. You abandoned, you defiled, you taught darkness, you will be kept, until the words became weight and the weight became silence. The prison received them far below the roots of hills, in chambers where light is a stranger and time walks with a limp. Pits open like mouths, and the bound were lowered into them as offerings to justice. There was no fire there, no feast, no song, only a hush so complete it made even memory sound loud. Over each mouth, seals were set, marks etched by the hands of those who had never faltered. Names were scored into stone, not to honor but to warn. The gates closed with a sound like an ocean inhaling, and the earth settled as if a fever had at last broken. Above ground, the air grew strangely clean. Idols seemed less certain of their power. Altars raised to shadows guttered without wind. Men did not see the pits, but they felt the shift, the way a wounded animal knows when the arrow has been pulled free though the pain remains. Yet the giants roamed still, untethered and hungry, fathered by those now entombed. Their roars reached the sky and found no answer from their makers. The silence below became terror above, a severed cord thrashing without the hand that had once held it. In the deep where the watchers lay, they heard a distant tremor, slow and vast, like oars dipping into a sea that did not yet exist. Water spoke in sleep around them, rehearsing future roads. The loyal hosts lifted from the valleys and returned to their stations, bright as winter stars. Enoch turned homeward with steps that felt the weight of days to come. The fallen were secured, but their sons still scrawled ruin across the map of men, and judgment had more to say. Far off, clouds began to gather with a patience that promised violence, and the horizon learned the shape of an ending that would walk on waves. The earth groaned as if weary of bearing them. The Nephilim, once proud rulers of valleys and mountains, felt the sky itself turning against them. Winds no longer carried their roars with triumph, but scattered them like warnings. Rivers they had bent to their thirst swelled in defiance, and storms gathered on horizons with a fury not born of weather. Their fathers were chained in darkness, their pleas unanswered, and now their own hour had come. What no sword of man could achieve, the hand of heaven prepared to finish. Armies of angels descended like lightning, torn into countless shards. They were not bound by hunger nor weakened by flesh, but carried judgment in every movement. Their wings beat with the sound of war drums, and their swords shone as if carved from dawn itself. Against such a host, the giants raged in futility. They hurled stones that split valleys, but the stones shattered like clay. They roared until mountains shook, but their cries fell silent under the clash of celestial steel. Their size, once terror to men, became only larger targets for the decree of the eternal. The battles were unlike anything the earth had endured. Fields turned into seas of blood, forests toppled beneath the trampling of titans, and the very air quivered with the clash of realms. Giants clawed at angels, but their hands burned as though grasping fire. They tried to flee into caves, but light followed them like a shadow they could not escape. Some fell upon one another in madness, struck not by blades, but by the dread of their certain end. Creation itself seemed to exhale relief as their numbers dwindled with every passing day. Men, who had once cowered beneath their dominion, watched from hidden places as the mighty fell. For the first time in generations, they saw giants bleed, giants stumble, giants cry out in fear. The terror that had enslaved them cracked, and within that crack, hope returned like a fragile dawn. Yet their joy was mingled with dread, for they knew the world would not escape unscathed. The ground itself was stained, and the sky seemed to tremble with the weight of what was unfolding. The Nephilim resisted with desperation, but their hunger betrayed them. They turned upon one another, driven by the same insatiable appetite that had once enslaved mankind. Brothers devoured brothers, fathers slew sons, their bodies collapsing into the very soil they had once ruled. What angels did not destroy, their own corruption consumed. The rebellion that had begun with union now ended in disintegration, every giant undone by the very fire that had burned within them since birth. When the last of them fell, silence spread across the land like a cloak. Villages emerged from hiding, staring at fields littered with the carcasses of beings once thought immortal. Mothers held their children tighter, fathers wept without shame, for the nightmare had ended, though its scars would never fully heal. Smoke rose not from feasts, but from the pyres of the fallen, their bones blackened by the fire of heaven's justice. Their names, once carved in fear upon the tongues of nations, were reduced to whispers, and even those whispers carried dread. Thus the extermination of the giants was complete, but the earth itself remained wounded. The rivers ran thick with memory, the soil groaned with what it had swallowed, and the sky seemed forever marked by their cries. The Nephilim had perished in body, but their spirits, restless and foul, remained chained to the world, wandering as shadows of terror. Their end was both victory and curse, victory for mankind, curse for the generations that would still feel their breath in nightmares. Judgment had struck, but the story was not yet finished, for the flood was still waiting on the horizon. The earth was stained, the heavens unsettled, and the cries of justice had not yet been silenced. Though the watchers lay chained in the abyss and the giants lay slain upon the fields, corruption still clung to every corner of creation. The Eternal, whose word cannot fail, released the final decree. The waters would rise. No army would march, no sword would gleam. This judgment would be the hand of the Creator himself, cleansing his masterpiece in a deluge vast enough to swallow mountains. The sky grew heavy, and the ground began to tremble as though aware of what approached. Noah, the chosen vessel of survival, obeyed the command to build an ark. With each swing of his hammer, each timber placed, the laughter of men rang around him. They mocked him as mad, a fool chasing shadows, a dreamer of doom. Yet his faith did not waver. He built not for the praise of men, but for the survival of covenant. His ark stood not as wood and pitch alone, but as prophecy given form, a vessel of mercy set against an ocean of wrath. Every board was a sermon, every nail a warning that time was ending. The heavens darkened beyond ordinary storms, clouds massed like armies, their bellies swollen with wrath. Lightning carved wounds across the sky, and thunder groaned like the voice of eternity itself. The first drops fell, heavy as stones, splattering against scorched earth. Rivers burst from their beds, springs erupted from the deep, and soon the rain became a curtain no eye could pierce. What began as laughter among the wicked turned to unease, then panic, then screams drowned beneath the roar of endless water. The giants had fallen, but their legacy remained in men who had learned violence, greed, and blasphemy. These men now found their idols sinking, their temples collapsing, their weapons rusting in the torrent. Kings who had strutted upon thrones now clawed at waves. Warriors who had crushed cities now begged for a foothold on drifting debris. Mothers clutched children as waters pried them from their arms, and cries for mercy rose louder than any battle chant. Yet mercy was sealed within the ark, and judgment alone filled the world outside. The ark groaned as it lifted from the ground, rising upon waves that swallowed plains and forests alike. Inside, Noah and his family sat in silence, the weight of both grief and deliverance pressing upon them. They heard the cries outside, the pounding fists upon the sealed doors, the desperate voices begging to be let in. Their hearts ached, but the Eternal himself had shut the door, and what he closes, no hand may open. The vessel drifted higher, carried not by chance but by the hand of providence through chaos no eye could measure. For 40 days and 40 nights the waters surged without relent. Mountains bowed beneath the waves, cities vanished into silence, and the earth became a formless sea, echoing the chaos before creation itself was spoken into order. Yet amid this undoing, the ark floated like a promise, a single flame amid endless dark. Inside it was covenant, outside it was judgment. The flood was not only destruction, it was renewal, a purging that tore down corruption so that life could rise again upon clean ground. At last, the rain ceased, but the silence that followed was deeper still. The waters stretched endlessly, reflecting the sky like a mirror of sorrow. No laughter remained, no defiance, no cries, only the hum of wind across waves. The flood had spoken, and its voice was final. Rebellion had a price, and creation would not endure corruption forever. Yet in that silence, hope lived. For within the ark was a man, a family, and a covenant. From them would rise a new beginning, proof that even in wrath, the Eternal does not forget mercy. When the last thunder rolled into memory and the final drop of rain was swallowed by the endless waters, a silence greater than the storm fell upon the world. The roar of waves that had crushed cities faded into stillness, and the screams of nations were replaced by the hollow breath of wind moving over a vast, endless sea. The earth, once scarred with violence and crowned with towers of pride, lay hidden beneath a shroud of water. The silence was not peace. It was the echo of judgment, a quietness too heavy for song. The ark floated as the only sentinel upon this drowned expanse. Its timbers creaked, speaking softly into the void, while inside, Noah and his family sat in reverence of what they had witnessed. They could not see the bones of cities beneath the waves, but they felt them. They could not hear the cries of the lost, but their silence pressed into the heart like a weight. The ark was more than a vessel of wood. It was a coffin for the world that had been, and a cradle for the world that would come. As the waters stretched unbroken to every horizon, the memory of chaos seemed unreal, as though swallowed by eternity. Yet the air carried a strange stillness, a scent of ash and salt mingled with the breath of rebirth. The sky, once black with storms, cleared into a canvas of pale gray, and the first timid rays of sun touched the waters like fingers of mercy, testing the wounds of creation. It was a beauty, both haunting and holy, a stillness born not of peace, but of cleansing. Within the ark, the silence seeped into every corner. Animals shifted uneasily, their instincts whispering that they were adrift between worlds. Noah's sons gazed at the endless waters, their eyes searching for the faintest sign of land, yet seeing none. Their wives wept softly, not only for the dead but for the enormity of survival itself. And Noah, bowed in prayer, knew that this silence was sacred. It was the pause between death and life, between what had been condemned and what would be renewed. For 40 days and nights the flood had raged. Now, for many more, the waters lingered like a guest that would not leave. Each sunrise brought no change, only the same mirror of sky and water, the same waiting. Patience itself became part of the trial, for judgment is swift, but restoration is slow. Noah's heart ached for the soil of earth beneath his feet, yet he waited, trusting that the Eternal, who had spoken of destruction, would also speak of deliverance. And the world beneath the waves, silent, broken, buried, whispered no more. The giants were gone, their cities lost, their echoes smothered. Men who had once sung songs of rebellion now slept beneath the tide. The silence was their monument, vast and terrible, an emptiness carved by justice. Only the ark remained, a lone flame in a drowned universe, carrying the fragile spark of life over the grave of a fallen age. Thus the silence after chaos endured, not as an ending, but as a waiting. The waters would recede, but not yet. The earth would breathe again, but not today. For now the world lay still beneath the hand of judgment, and above it floated hope, sealed within wood and faith. The silence was heavy, but within it stirred the promise that soon the Eternal would speak again, and his words would call forth new life from the ruins of the old. When the waters finally began to retreat, rolling back like curtains pulled from the stage of the world, the ark settled upon the raw bones of mountains. Valleys emerged as scars, forests lay drowned in silence, and plains once filled with nations glistened under the sun as mirrors of ruin. Noah stepped forth onto this cleansed earth, his feet sinking into soil softened by judgment. Around him, the horizon looked empty, as though creation itself had been rewoven. Yet from this emptiness, the Eternal prepared to write again, not a decree of destruction, but a promise of hope. The first act of Noah upon solid ground was not to build a home, nor to search for food, but to raise an altar. Stones were gathered, wood arranged, and fire lit. The smoke curled heavenward, carrying gratitude mixed with sorrow, a sacrifice that spoke of survival and of loss. Noah bowed before the Eternal, acknowledging not his own worth, but the mercy that had carried him through the flood. The altar became a bridge between heaven and earth, a declaration that life had been preserved not by chance, but by covenantal grace. And heaven answered. The Eternal spoke words unlike those of judgment, words wrapped not in thunder, but in tenderness. Never again will I curse the ground because of man, though his heart inclines to evil. Never again will I destroy all life with a flood. These words, heavy with authority, were also light with mercy. They bound heaven and earth together in a vow, assuring that though humanity may falter, creation would never again be purged in such a deluge. The same God who had wielded waters now offered promise. As a seal to this covenant, the Eternal stretched his bow across the sky. A rainbow arched from horizon to horizon, bending light into colors never before seen by the eyes of men. It was no mere spectacle of nature, it was a divine signature, a reminder etched into the fabric of the heavens themselves. Whenever clouds gathered, whenever storms threatened, mankind would look up and see the bow, not drawn for war, but laid down in peace. It was the Eternal's oath, visible to all generations. Mercy would triumph over wrath. Noah gazed upon the rainbow with tears streaming down his face, for he knew its weight. His sons stood beside him, witnesses to a promise that would outlast their lifetimes. They understood that their survival was not simply for themselves, but for the seed of nations, for generations yet unborn who would inherit the earth. The covenant was not only with Noah, but with all life. The beasts that stirred upon the land, the birds that lifted into the sky, and the creeping things that crawled across the soil. All creation shared in the blessing of the bow. The covenant transformed silence into purpose. Where once the world had been an empty grave, now it became a cradle again. Men would sow and reap, day would follow night, seasons would turn in faithful rhythm. The Eternal guaranteed the order of creation, binding himself to its endurance. And though sin would rise again, though men would stumble and rebel, they would always live beneath the ark of promise, under skies marked by mercy. Judgment had spoken, but covenant now sang. Thus Noah became not only the survivor of a flood, but the bearer of a promise. His name would be remembered not merely as the builder of an ark, but as the man with whom God renewed the bond of heaven and earth. The rainbow became his crown, and the covenant his legacy. It proclaimed to all who came after that, though the earth may tremble, though nations may rage, the Eternal's word of mercy will stand unbroken. And every storm, every cloud, every drop of rain would carry a hidden reminder. Beyond wrath, there is always covenant. Long after the waters had receded and the earth breathed again beneath the sun, whispers of the giants lingered like shadows at the edges of memory. Their bodies had fallen, their voices silenced, yet mankind could not forget the terror they had inspired. In caves and ruins, in fragments of shattered cities buried beneath mud and stone, traces of their reign remained. Men who tilled the soil stumbled upon bones vast as pillars, skulls larger than their own bodies, and they trembled, for these were not the relics of beasts, but of beings who had once walked as gods among mortals. Fathers told their sons stories of the Nephilim in hushed tones, not as lessons of glory, but as warnings. They spoke of creatures who devoured the earth, who enslaved nations, who mocked the heavens. They warned that pride and hunger had brought these giants to ruin, and that men who followed their path would find the same destruction. Yet as the generations turned, the memory shifted. Some remembered the giants as monsters, but others as heroes, mighty figures whose power stirred envy. The line between history and legend blurred, and from that blur grew myths that haunted the world. The spirits of the giants, restless and unclean, wandered the earth as shadows, unable to find rest. Men felt their presence in dreams, in nightmares that clawed at their sleep. Some believed these spirits whispered forbidden knowledge, tempting kings with promises of power, leading sorcerers into arts best left forgotten. Thus, though the bodies of the Nephilim had perished, their legacy of corruption seeped like poison into the veins of humanity. They became the invisible tyrants, feeding fear and ambition long after their flesh had turned to dust. Ruins bore their mark, walls too massive for men to raise, stones cut with a precision no tool could explain. Nomads crossing the lands of old whispered that such places were cursed, that the ground itself remembered the footsteps of giants. Travelers swore that at night they could hear echoes, deep rumblings like laughter beneath the soil. Whether truth or imagination, the memory of the Nephilim clung to these places like smoke that never disperses. The earth itself seemed unwilling to release their shadow. Some men, blinded by fascination, began to worship the memory of giants. They carved idols in their likeness, raising them as symbols of strength. They prayed not to heaven, but to echoes, seeking to reclaim the power that had once shaken the world. And thus the cycle of corruption threatened to begin anew, not with the presence of living giants, but with the worship of their memory. Men turned ruins into temples, bones into relics, and shadows into gods. The silence after the flood trembled once more with whispers of rebellion. Yet prophets rose to remind the people. The giants were not heroes, but warnings. They were monuments of judgment, not of greatness. Their downfall was a message etched into history, that no matter how high rebellion climbs, it will be brought low by the hand of the Eternal. The memory of the Nephilim was not meant to inspire awe, but to instill reverence, a reminder that corruption carries consequence. But men, forgetful as ever, wavered between fear and fascination, between obedience and idolatry. Thus, the memory of the giants endured, a shadow stretching across centuries. It lived in myths, in ruins, in restless spirits, in whispered tales around fires at night. It became both curse and temptation, warning and lure. The flood had cleansed the earth, but it could not erase memory, and memory itself carried the power to shape destiny. The giants were gone, yet their echoes remained. Echoes that would whisper to kings, stir empires, and challenge the hearts of men until the end of days. Amid the ruins of a world drowned and the silence of a creation reborn, whispers spoke of a book, an ancient record carried through the flood, hidden within the heart of Noah's line. It was said to contain not the tales of men, but the secrets of angels, the forbidden knowledge once poured into the ears of mortals by the fallen watchers. While the waters had erased cities and silenced the roar of giants, these secrets endured, etched into words that smoldered like embers beneath the ash of history. The Book of Secrets was not a treasure of gold or stone, but a burden of memory too powerful to be forgotten. Legends told that it contained the names of the Watchers, the covenant of their rebellion, and the arts they had taught: sorcery, enchantments, the carving of weapons, the charting of stars. To hold the book was to hold the weight of corruption itself, a mirror reflecting the sins that had invited the flood. Yet it was also said to hold warnings, prophecies of judgment, revelations of what would come in the final days. Its pages were shadows, but they were also fire, capable of consuming or illuminating, depending on the heart that dared to read. The survivors of the flood feared it, for they had seen what such knowledge could birth. Noah himself treated it not as a prize, but as a curse to be guarded. His sons quarreled over its worth. Some argued it should be destroyed, cast into the deep where no man could find it. Others whispered that it should be preserved, lest future generations repeat the folly of the past, without warning. So the book lingered in secrecy, passed like a whisper from hand to hand, hidden from kings, concealed from priests, guarded by those who understood the cost of its words. As centuries turned, fragments of its knowledge leaked into the world. A chant here, a star map there, tools forged with strange precision, echoes of the forbidden that men could not resist. Sorcerers claimed they had seen the book in dreams. Scribes insisted they had glimpsed its letters in visions. Some swore that Enoch himself had inscribed it under the command of heaven, not as rebellion, but as testimony. Whether it was a relic of darkness or a monument of warning, none could agree. Its mystery became its power, its secrecy, its throne. Kings sent armies to search for it, believing it would grant dominion. Priests denounced it, yet secretly longed for its pages. Wanderers claimed to have stolen lines of it, written on fragments of stone or parchment. But each version contradicted the other. Perhaps this was its curse, that even in rumor, it sowed division, tempting men with the allure of knowledge they were never meant to hold.